So we are continuing in this Exodus series. In fact, we're going to kind of spend the rest of October in this, and then we'll conclude this on October 31st. And we've kind of worked our way through some of the initial elements of really the seeing the Israelites in Egypt and being held captive there and the oppression that they were experiencing. We see this incredibly providential moment where Moses' mother seeks to protect her little boy because of the edict given to kill all of the little boys. And that somehow providentially God provides not just rescue for Moses, but ultimately to be placed into Pharaoh's home through his daughter, for his own mother to be able to care for Moses. We see Moses grow up in this environment. Some of the scholars, Josephus specifically, seems to identify that this particular Pharaoh had no sons. And so it's very possible that Moses was being raised to be this Pharaoh's successor. But instead, Moses, in his anger and his protection, kills an Egyptian. That gets exposed, and so he runs essentially as now a convict who's on the run. He goes out into the wilderness, and he's in the wilderness for 40 years, and he takes a wife, and he's kind of made a life for himself, and then God reveals himself through this burning bush that doesn't burn up. And there's this encounter that Moses has with God at this burning bush, where Moses gives him all of his ridiculous excuses. And ultimately, Moses' last excuse is, just send somebody else. I'm not your guy. And as we heard last week, God's response to all of that was to look at Moses and say, this isn't really even about you. This is about me and my plan and my power and my purposes and what I'm going to do through you simply serving as a vessel. Why Exodus? Why are we even studying this? What we've said is that one of the most important things that we can understand is that we are part of a larger story. Because if we don't recognize that we're part of a larger story that's been being told for thousands of years, where God is both the story writer and through Jesus, the hero of that story, we will find ourselves, if we don't understand that, thinking that we can write our own story and that we're the hero of our own story. And that we are the center of our story, when the reality is we are not the center of our story. God is. And he so desperately wants us to capture him. And what he also understands is this: if we don't understand that he's the center of the story and we make ourselves that, we will be held captive by our own appetites, our own desires, and the kind of fulfilling life, in fact, the incredible life that he has planned for us, will never be accessible to us because we will ensnare ourselves with our own inability to manage our appetites and our fears and our insecurities. And so we are part of a larger story, a story that is revealing God's plan, his purposes, his power, and the promises that he is fulfilling in that. It's interesting to me because one of the aspects of Exodus that's so obvious to us is that in the Exodus we see God bringing rescue. We see God bringing restoration and reconciliation. We see him accomplishing what we so desperately need in life, and that is to be set free from our own self-interest, our own desire for self-protection, our own desire to control our own destinies. And there's been some wonderful commentaries written on this, but one of those that's come up recently that I've really appreciated is found a book called Echoes of in Egypt, Exodus, where the authors of this book take this idea of the Exodus, of the rescue, and they run it through kind of the thread of Scripture, and they see it showing up over and over and over again. But one of the things that we have to capture is that the freedom that God wants for us, as Ben said last week, is never just freedom from something. He wants us to be free for something else. And if we don't recognize that, then we will be free from something, but we'll find ourselves ensnared in something else. It's why so often addicts who get free from one addiction find themselves addicted to something else. Because they never really dealt with the core issues, the core wounds that were swirling around that led to the addiction in the first place. They thought the addiction itself was the problem rather than the things that led them to that. And then they jump into another addiction and another addiction and another addiction. And in this book, Echoes of Exodus, the authors say it this way. They say, our generation is confused as to the nature of true freedom. No matter how often we experience liberation from constraints, those things that ensnare us, limitations and oppression, we find ourselves falling into new forms of bondage. We think that we're now free to be ourselves, and yet we don't realize that we fall prey to new forms of bondage. We get free from boredom when we fall into the slavery of distraction. We call that cell phones nowadays. We pursue liberty from prohibitions and fall into bondage to addictions. We escape repression and become enslaved to our own lusts. We are released from isolation and fall captive to peer pressure and the power of the online mob to tell us we're okay and that we matter. We pursue liberty from the constraints upon our natures and fall into bondage to our unrestrained passions. See, one of the things that Exodus shows us about the larger story is this simple fact. Freedom isn't about autonomy and self-sufficiency. It isn't about us being able to do what we want, when we want, how we want, which is kind of the American dream, by the way. The American dream is I get to do what I want, when I want, how I want, as long as nobody else gets hurt. Freedom isn't really about the American dream. Again, we've somehow caught up this idea of that too often in our own minds. But freedom isn't about autonomy and self-sufficiency. Real freedom, biblical freedom, God-ordained freedom is about surrender and dependence. That we surrender to Him and who He is and what He wants to accomplish and to His purposes, no matter how much we may disagree or not like them. And we declare our dependence on Him because He is the only one who's capable of accomplishing the things that we want to see accomplished ultimately and that we need to see accomplished in our lives and of those that we love. And so we find ourselves now today looking at the 10 plagues. Maybe other than the crossing of the Red Sea, maybe the most famous story in Exodus, the 10 plagues of Egypt. And we see these plagues play themselves out over the course of what we think on a calendar is about a year long, that these plagues take place over the course of about a year. And we're familiar with many of them. The Nile was turned to blood, then the frogs, then the lice, then the flies, then all of the cattle die, boils, fire like hail, or hail with fire rains down from heaven, then the swarm of locusts come, then darkness for 3 days, and then the death of the firstborn. But to be honest with you, one of these we have to stop and realize is that the plagues are a response to a specific question. And if we go back in the narrative, what we realize is that Moses first approaches Pharaoh and says, let these people go and go worship their God. And Pharaoh says no, but what he also says is he poses a question to Pharaoh Pharaoh poses a question to Moses because Moses says, the I am, Yahweh says you need to let them go. And Pharaoh's response is, who is the Lord, this Yahweh, that I should obey His voice? Who is this Yahweh? Who is this God that I should obey His voice? And to be honest with you, the plagues are kind of the response to that question. God says, you want to know who I am? I'll show you who I am. You really aren't sure that you should listen to me? Let me show you who I am. Can I just take a moment to ponder this? Is it possible that in our own personal lives, on occasion, we ask the question, do I really need to listen to Him? Do I really need to do what He says? Is His plan really the right one? Can't I determine my own sexual appetites and pursuits? Can't I determine my own identity for myself? Can't I operate relationally however I choose to? Can't I assign myself politically however I want to? Do I really have to listen to Him? And God's response to Pharaoh should sober us a little bit, because if we're really going to pose that question, maybe not in those words, but very much in our actions, we probably need to be careful, because God's already shown us what He does when that question's asked and what He's capable of doing in the midst of that. And so we go back in the narrative where this encounter that Moses has with God, where he tells us this in Exodus 3. But I know that the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, will not let go unless a mighty hand compels him. God tells Moses ahead of time at the burning bush, here's the deal. I know I know that Pharaoh is not going to let you go unless he's compelled to do so. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward these people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters. And don't miss this, because we'll circle back to this. And so you are going to plunder the Egyptians. Pharaoh wants to know who I am. I'm going to show him who I am. Those that are your oppressors are now going to be your benefactors. You're going to plunder them. You're going to take whatever valuables you can from them. And I can imagine Moses going, that doesn't sound possible in the oppression that we're experiencing. So God sends Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh, and we pick this up in Exodus chapter 7. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my signs and wonder in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment, I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. And the Egyptians will know. Who am I that you should listen to me? The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, and will stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded them. We pick up in verse 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle, then say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake. And so Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they did just what the Lord commanded. And Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same thing. They throw their sticks down, and they become snakes. Check out what it says. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. That these guys, well, we can perform that trick. They throw their staffs down, they become snakes, and Aaron's staff that became a snake goes over and swallows up these snakes and becomes even larger as a result. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. And so the plagues begin. And the first one is that the Nile turns to blood. And then Pharaoh relents, and he says, okay, I'll let him go. And then he changes his mind. And so the frogs come. And I just want to take a moment, because there's this interplay during the frog encounter where the text tells us that the frogs are going to be in your bedrooms and in your beds and in your sinks, like they are going to take over everything. And Pharaoh is dealing with this mass hysteria because frogs are disgusting and they're everywhere. Everywhere. So Pharaoh calls Moses and Aaron to deal with this. And it says, Moses said to Pharaoh, I leave it to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile. Pharaoh says, Moses and Aaron, come on, we got to get rid of these frogs. What do I need to do? And Moses is like, I'm going to leave it up to you. When do you want them gone? Check out what Pharaoh says. In fact, read it with me. What's the word? Tomorrow. Pharaoh, I'm going to leave it up to you. When do you want the frogs gone? Tomorrow. Why not right now? Why not right now? I don't understand. I'm so convinced that when we are in overt rebellion, we become so delusional that we don't even understand what we're saying sometimes. And Pharaoh's response to these stupid frogs is, I'll do it tomorrow. Which I would imagine the court around Pharaoh is going, what? Do you understand how disgusting this is? We root on. Tomorrow, Pharaoh said. Moses replied, it will be as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials and your people. They will remain only in the Nile, where they're supposed to be, by the way. After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs, and Pharaoh has committed to let the people go if Moses does this. He had brought on Pharaoh, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, in the fields. By the way, they didn't just recede back into the Nile, they died where they were. The cleanup after that had to be awful. The smell had to be even worse. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But the very next sentence is the one I want us to capture. Because the very next sentence, I love you. I love you dearly, and I want you to capture this with me. What Pharaoh does next in response to this is all too convicting to me. Because I kind of think we kind of do something similar. I kind of think we operate a little bit similar to this. Check out what it says. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. When there was relief from these frogs jumping everywhere, and he wasn't fielding constant complaints, and he wasn't dealing with constant croaking, Pharaoh's response was what? Nah, I'm good. I ain't sending him out of here. Nope, we're not doing it. Again, maybe this isn't you, but I think it's more of us than we want to admit. All too often, when we experience relief from the consequences of our actions, too often we also feel relief from the responsibility of our actions. See, here's what we do, and boy, oh boy, we are really, really good at this. We perceive God's patience with us is his apathy towards what we're doing. God's being gracious with us in our defiance. He's being gracious with us in our unforgiveness. He's being gracious with us in our mistreatment of our spouse. He's being gracious with us in our lack of generosity. He's being gracious with us in our lack of justice. He's being gracious with us, and we think it's because he's okay with it. And because we're not suffering the consequences for it, we just move on with life. But what we're doing is we're twisting the reality of the reaping and sowing dynamic of the world that God created, which means down the road we have a significant problem in our lives and we go, this isn't fair. And God's going, dude, you sowed that a long, long time ago. And you mistook my patience for my apathy and my okayness with this. And while we should empathize with each other in that, and we need to walk with each other in light of that because we're all kind of prone towards it, the reality is this. Just because we're not suffering the consequences of it doesn't mean that God is okay with it, and we are not relieved of the responsibility for it. So we have the 10 plagues, and they play out. And here's what we kind of do. We kind of read through the 10 plagues of the lice and the frogs and the boils, and we're like, these are just random things. But here's what's really going on in the text. I called this message the battle of the gods. Because what Yahweh, the God of Israel, is actually doing is he's taking on a direct assault to the gods of Egypt. They had many, many, many gods. And what he does in this year of judgment is he exposes the futility and the impotence of the Egyptian gods. He turns the water of the Nile to blood. Happy, the Egyptian god of the Nile, and Osiris, the Egyptian god of the Nile, were supposed to be the ones that brought fertility to the land. He says, you want to believe in those gods? You want to trust in those gods? Let me show you how impotent they really are. The god Hecate, the goddess of fertility and renewal, guess what? She had the head of a frog. So he goes, you want to worship that god? Let's show you what that looks like to have to deal with frogs. The god Geb, the god of the earth, lice comes out of the dust of the ground and covers the land, taking on a direct assault to the god Geb. Capri, the god of creation, movement of the sun, had the head of a fly, so he sends a swarm of flies, again, to expose the impotence of this god. I think in some ways mocking this God. Hathor, the goddess of love and protection, happened to have the head of a cow. So he sends a pandemic to strike down the cattle. Isis, the goddess of medicine and peace, sends boils and sores all over the people. The god Nut, true story. Egyptian goddess of the sky, what does he do? He brings hail from the sky like fire that comes down and torches the land. The god Seth, the god of storms and disorder, brings locusts as this giant storm to come through and consume everything that was left still alive, plant life and otherwise. Ra, the sun god. You want to worship the sun god? Let's just make it completely dark for 3 days. Could you imagine that? Complete darkness for 3 days. And then Pharaoh, who's identified as the preeminent power in the land. God sends a plague to kill the firstborn son all over. Now here's the deal. We sanitize this. And there's no way I can get you to feel it, smell it, taste it, experience it. So what I've decided to do instead is I'm just going to show you a few-minute video where you get to see a little bit of the disgusting nature, the debilitating nature of these plagues. Take a look at this video with me. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, "We're all going to die." So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs, wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. Don't miss this. So they plundered the Egyptians, just as God had promised Moses. In this battle of the gods, God has exposed the futility and the impotence of the Egyptian gods. But the gods were what the Egyptians had gone to anticipating fertility. Their very livelihoods. In fact, they depended on the gods for their happiness, for their meaning, and their fulfillment in life. And because the Israelites had been there for 400 years, so much of what the Egyptians had worshipped and the gods and how they operated had leaked into the Israelite ways of thinking and working. And so the Israelites also depended on the Egyptian gods to define their meaning and purpose and to experience happiness. Which means that I think at the end of the day, God used the plagues to both rescue the Israelites from the Egyptians, but he also did it to prove his power over the Egyptian gods to the Israelites. To establish again that he is Yahweh, the one true God. And while they have found meaning and purpose, and they have found so much of their hope in these Egyptian gods, that he is the all-powerful, only God to be worshipped. Scholars talk about it this way. They say the 10 plagues of Egypt were acts of divine justice by God against the oppressors of his people. They demonstrated the power of the one true God and exposed the gods of the Egyptians worshipped as false. Each plague corresponded to particular Egyptian gods and served to prove both to the Egyptians and to the Israelites who the true sovereign ruler of Egypt and the entire world really was. An incredible story of God's power and his mastery over all of these other Egyptian gods. And we can take a moment to consider the greatness of our God. And we can pray, and we can go home. And if I was a nice pastor, I would do just that. But that's not who I am, and that's not who we are. So what I want to do for a few moments is I want to take another step forward, and I want to make us all really uncomfortable for a few minutes. Because I want us to capture what God was doing in this as he was dismantling the things that his own people found their hope and their happiness and their meaning and their purpose in. Because we have the same tendencies to find our hope and our happiness and our meaning and our fulfillment in other things. In fact, quite frankly, we tend to worship other things, and we don't even realize that we're worshiping them because we're just holding them so close to us, and the terrifying fear of them being taken away from us is debilitating to us. Keller says it this way: everybody has got to live for something, but Jesus makes the case that if he is not that thing that you live for, it will fail you. First, it will enslave you. Whatever that thing is, you will tell yourself that you will have it. Whatever that thing is, you will tell yourself that you have to have it or there is no tomorrow. That means that anything threatens it, you will become inordinately scared. If anyone blocks it, you will become inordinately angry. And if you fail to achieve it, you will never be able to forgive yourself. But the second, if you do achieve it, it will fail to deliver the fulfillment that you expected. In fact, I would love us to consider this. Discovering what we are most prone to pursue, to find our happiness, our fulfillment in, empowers us to recognize how and when that pursuit can compromise our own spiritual journeys. That if we're not careful, other things will take priority for us. And again, we look at idolatry and we look at all of this pagan worship in the Old Testament. We're like, that's not us. That's not who we are. We don't have idols. Are you sure? We're 2021 American citizens. We got idols. We got idols. And we are so often prone to not even understand them. In fact, practical theologians kind of take this whole conversation and they summarize it into 4 things. And they basically say this: most people, again, I'm not imposing this on you. You can dismiss this in a second, although I'm going to challenge you in a second that you're going to probably not be able to. But you can dismiss it. That's okay. But practical theologians suggest this, that most of us find our meaning, our purpose, our fulfillment. Most of us, the idols that we worship, fit into 4 categories: comfort and pleasure. As Americans, we might find our purpose in that. Power and authority. The power that we wield, our authority, or our autonomy, the autonomy to do what we want, when we want, how we want. Personal security and the security of those around us. Or our own significance. That we want to feel significant. Now, here's what we're prone to do. We look at those and go, yeah, there's some challenge in there, but that's not me. So here's where we're all going to get uncomfortable. Ready? I'm just going to ask you to consider for a moment. I'm going to walk through some suggested ways in which these 4 might show up in our lives. You ready? This is how they might show up in our lives. If your tendency is to depend on or rely on comfort and pleasure at the expense of really trusting God, you make sure that you avoid taking any risks whenever possible, financially, relationally, or otherwise. You have a rigid boundary when it comes to how you spend your time with others, when your feelings get hurt by other people, or dealing with needy people. You have really rigid boundaries. Comfort and pleasure might be an idol for you. You regularly allow what you want right now to undermine what is most important in life. The addiction side of this, right? Or you find yourself addicted to something that strips you of the opportunity to effectively invest in those you love and you care for because you can't let go of this thing that's ensnaring you. Comfort and pleasure might be yours. Okay, it's not yours. That's fine. Let's go to the next one. Power and autonomy. Ready? You work tirelessly to acquire a prominent position of power at the expense of relationships or other responsibilities. You let go of some of your responsibilities as a parent, as a spouse, to your covenant community. You dismiss those responsibilities in pursuit of things that are going to make you feel more successful. You avoid accountability, and you have areas of your life that you intentionally keep in the shadows. If power and autonomy is kind of yours. You criticize others for being too emotional, and you're unable and unwilling to share your emotional world with other people. Power and autonomy might be your idol. You believe counseling and the whole idea of going to see somebody in this arena is for only weak people. You might have a problem with power and autonomy. What about security? You are regularly stressed about money and you're unable to trust God to meet your needs. In fact, money creates all kinds of major conflicts in your marriage. What if it's security? You possess an insatiable need for regular affirmation or reassurance from others about how much they love and care for you. You constantly perceive you are being slighted, criticized, or judged by others. And your physical safety and those of the ones you love cause you to demonize others or fail to express love in a sacrificial way. Security might be an idol for you. Significance? You often find yourself feeling disrespected and devalued in everyday interactions. You serve others with the desperate need to feel significant to them. You grow angry and frustrated if you do not receive the validation and appreciation you think you've earned. You often refuse to continue to share and invest in others if they fail to express adequate gratitude for what you do. You may have skated over all of that, but I'm not sure that any of us really are successful at that. all of us find ourselves somewhere wrestling with some of these things. I'm pretty sure practical theologians that have written on this are probably pretty accurate about where some of our hopes are found. But how do we navigate that? How do we find hope in that? I love what Jesus says in Matthew 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus says, I want you to come to me because I'm the only thing that you can worship and depend on that will not ultimately disappoint you. And ultimately didn't snare you. It's been said well that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. When we find ourselves fully satisfied and we deal with these other areas and we trust him in the midst of it, he is most glorified in us. And then this last one. God is seeking to transform us in a way that both sanctifies and satisfies us. Meaning, if I pursue God's best for my life, I promise you, as much as it may feel incredibly difficult, and as much as there may be things about God's design and his purpose for our life that don't feel like they're going to give us what we're looking for, ultimately his great desire is to satisfy us deeply in a way that nothing else can. So let's consider this together. Which of the four pursuits are you most prone to find your meaning, your happiness, and your fulfillment in? Comfort and pleasure, power, autonomy, security, significance. You can't do anything about it unless you're willing to identify it. How often do I take time to focus on delighting and being satisfied in Christ and realizing what he's offered me? And how does my music, my media, and my amusement choices help me to increase my delight and my satisfaction in Christ? Because we are satiated with all kinds of stuff on our phones and the media, on social media, that distract us from and that convince us that we need other things to make us feel better. It takes us away from what God desires, which is for us to find true security, meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in him. And all of that is possible because of the cross. All of that is possible because of what he accomplished on the cross, and that he made a way so that when we come to him and we seek him, he has set us free, true freedom, set us free from all of those things that ensnare and bind us and want to derail his purposes in our lives. And so I'm going to invite you to take the bread that was representative of his body that was broken for us. And we take it and we eat it in remembrance of him. And then we take the drink. Again, representative of his blood that was poured out for us. The shedding of the blood that covers our sin. We're to take it and drink it in remembrance of him. And we're told that every time we do this, we proclaim his death until the day that he ultimately returns. Because he didn't stay dead, he rose again. And he will bring us the fulfillment that we desire if we're willing to trust him for it. Would you stand together, please?